Merci à toutes et à tous de venir aujourd'hui malgré le beau temps. La salle est très noire, donc on voit assez peu de visages, mais je vais essayer de lire la salle mieux en termes de mes questions. La manière dont j'ai conçu cette masterclass, c'est de passer 1 heure pour que Christine nous parle des films, notamment ceux qui sont montrés pendant le festival, pour qu'on ait plus de contexte. Et après, la salle aura le temps de poser ses propres questions. Donc je vais switcher en anglais et Anna fera la traduction après chaque question-réponse. So thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
I guess I wanted to start with a very broad question so that everybody is at the same level of understanding about what your job is, which is there's no school to become a producer. So what does it entail to be a producer, and do you feel like your job has changed in the last decade?
I think probably the question I get asked the most is, what does a producer do? And I think the problem is there's so many different answers. So my answer is, in many ways, the easiest way to think of it is a producer is the engine on the train. So I find material, great stories, articles, books, and then I try to put together the elements, actors, directors, and then eventually financing that helps it on the path to getting made.
You also wrote 2 books. It was interesting to read A Killer Life that came out in 2006 because you talk a lot about how you actually made a lot of the films that are going to be shown during the festival. There was one quote that was interesting to me about how you defined your work, and so I'm going to quote you. The professional demands on me forced me to really examine what the job was. When you're committed to artistic filmmaking, you've got to behave in some ways like an artist. You have to continually challenge assumptions about what works, what risks are worth taking, how movies reach people, and what stories are appropriate to tell. And this quote comes in the chapter about kids by Larry Clark. And so I thought that was interesting that you put yourself also in this artist's perspective. And do you see that your job is a craft, and do you see parallels between when you work with the director from how they deliver their work to how you create yours and how you craft yours?
I think there is a misconception, or in my mind a misconception, that films are made with a director only making artistic decisions and a producer only making financial ones. And in fact, the true collaboration on a film, the thing that makes it interesting to me, or as I say in America, we call it show business for a reason. What makes it interesting to me is those decisions have to collide all the time. Artistic decisions on a film are inherently financial ones, and financial decisions are inherently artistic. The other thing I think is important about American filmmaking is it is market-driven. And I speak a lot in Europe, and I know that most other countries, filmmaking survives to some extent, to a large extent, because of government subsidies. That's not the case in the US, which means we have to listen to our audience. We have to pay attention to what people want to see. Now, some people might be surprised that I, who make a lot of art house films, feel that very deeply, but I do. I do feel that ultimately films are about a conversation between the filmmaking team and the audience, and when you take that away, the filmmaking suffers. Todd Haynes made a short film right after we first met, and we did go to the same college, but we didn't really know each other there. We met really in New York right afterwards, and he made a short film that has since been banned called Superstar, the Karen Carpenter story. Now, it's not that easy to see, but it shows up online all the time, on YouTube, etc. So I would say, as soon as you get home, see if you can find it, because it's a fantastic film. So when I saw that film for the first time, I had an epiphany, because I realized that he was making a movie that was wholly original, provocative, subversive, but also extremely entertaining. And I thought, okay, that's what I want to do.
And so then you started producing his films, and you just showed May, December in Cannes last year.
Year before last.
Year before last. Time flies. And so it's one of the collaborators you've worked the most with. How does that relationship evolve over the years? And do you feel like you both kind of shift in how you work together? Or do you feel like it's been this constant collaboration where you know each other so well?
So, of course, it's changed over time because we've changed. But you know, after I saw Superstar, I said to Todd, I want to produce your next film, and it should be a feature film. And I think what's happened is, you know, Todd is one of the few film directors, in my opinion, who does not make the same film twice. And every film is a new adventure. We trust each other very much. We don't always agree, and that's better, I think. I think it's better to work with people who you have differences with, because it makes everything more interesting. And now, you know, we're on maybe our 9th or 10th collaboration, I would have to count. And every time, you know, every movie, I dive into something new with him, and that's incredibly exciting.
Can you tell us more about Carol, which is being screened here? Did you have the project and bring it to him, or did he read the book and bring it? How did it work?
Neither. Carol is based on a Patricia Highsmith novel originally called in English The Price of Salt. I have no idea why. And that book was republished, I think, in the late 80s in English. And a lot of people were reading it. And various people optioned it for film. And the script, there were a couple of different versions of the script that started coming into our office. One time it came for Kim Pierce, who directed Boys Don't Cry, wrote and directed Boys Don't Cry. Another time it came in for Rose Trochet, who wrote and directed Go Fish and The Safety of Objects. I kind of forgot about it. And, you know, years went by, and then I found out that a close friend of mine, Elizabeth Carlson, had optioned it and had attached Cate Blanchett. She also attached a director. The director was Phyllida Lloyd, who did Mamma Mia. So one day, I was on the phone with Elizabeth, and we had just taken out a new script of Todd's, and it looked like it wasn't going to happen. And I said to Elizabeth, just from one friend to another, you know, I don't think this movie's going to go. And she said, well, I just heard that my director has a personal issue she has to deal with. I don't think my movie's going to go either. And then there was a silence. And we both said at the same time, we should show Carol to Todd. That was a Friday. And by Monday, he had committed to the movie. I mean, it's also, you know, he already had a relationship with Cate from I'm Not There, the better Bob Dylan film. So that was a big attraction for him, obviously. But I think it also was the first screenplay that Todd did that he had not written himself. And I do believe, with no disrespect to the wonderful screenwriter Phyllis Nage, but I do feel that Todd was able to elevate the material even more in many ways by deciding that there was a lot of material that the characters should not say to each other. So in some ways, his real strength was taking away.
Did you feel like watching the dailies that you were going to have a masterpiece right away, that it was going to have a huge impact on the lesbian community and become right away something important?
We always feel watching the dailies that it's going to be a masterpiece. I think, realistically, since, I've done over 100 films. In fact, I think I've made over 120. And I know that it takes a while to actually know what you have and to understand how an audience will react to it. It's a process. I think when we showed Carol at Cannes, that was kind of the first time, it was the first time that I had shown a film at Cannes when Twitter was incredibly active. And I remember sitting at a restaurant while the press screening was happening. And at the end of the press screening, they've changed this now. I think now the press screening reactions don't come till after.
Now they do the press screenings at the same time as the official, right. So then the press comes out when you guys come out.
Exactly. So this was different. And I was sitting with Todd and checking my phone, and, he doesn't do Twitter, of course, but he was like, what's going on? And then I started to see the reactions, which were just through the roof. And then when the film came out, it was a critical and popular success very quickly. It was one of the last movies that the Weinstein Co. released. So they were already running out of money, and that had an impact on the film's distribution, unfortunately. But Carol is what we call, I don't know if you'll be able to translate this, we call it an evergreen. And that means it's a movie that doesn't die, okay? And every year, for example, how old is the film? 10 or 11 years old now? Every year it shows in various theaters as a Christmas movie. Yeah. I never thought I'd make a Christmas movie. Although there's one that John Waters wants to make that we want to make with him that we might get to make. And people keep rediscovering it. There's all kinds of fan fiction. People still send beautiful drawings they've made of Kate, of Rooney, of their characters to Todd. They post them online. It's a movie that gets discovered again and again.
From what I've gathered from interviews, you don't seem to be a very nostalgic person, but I would like to still talk about the beginning of your career and Todd's career and talk about the AIDS crisis. I once interviewed Darren Star, who's one of the producers of Sex and the City, and I asked him why he had made that show. And he told me he made that show because of the AIDS epidemic, because he wanted to show New York as a city that was going to be, again, vibrant with women. And when I read your book, I was also kind of struck by how the AIDS epidemic seemed to have really had an impact on you. And I was wondering how you being, and how ACT UP and being part of ACT UP and how you being an activist had shaped the way you produce movies, and if you feel like those two things had been related or not at all.
I think in the early 90s, when we were making these films and the AIDS crisis was raging, there was a sense among filmmakers like us, queer filmmakers, that there was a sense of urgency and a sense that if we didn't tell our stories, nobody else would. And that really fueled movies like Poison, Todd's first feature, but also movies by other filmmakers like Greg Araki, who made The Living End, Isaac Julian, who made Looking for Langston. Just this sense that we were running out of time.
But can I just read a quote of your book? It'll be very short, but I thought it was interesting. You write, one of the secrets of ACT UP was that lesbians and straight women came in and organized it because they'd been politically active for years. The guys weren't. They'd been going to Fire Island, doing crystal and having sex for hours on the beach. And so I'm interested in how activism actually shows up in the way then you work. And I'm wondering if, like, knowing how to, be an activist, a political activist or a cultural activist, how does it shape the way you produce movies today?
Well, representation is an extraordinarily powerful thing. And the desire of all of us, just as human beings, to see our stories on screen, to be able to look at a story and say, that's me, that's my experience, is it's an enormous part of cinema. And I realized very quickly when I made Poison that if I could make a film for the right amount of money and it appealed only to a queer audience, then if it was made for the right amount of money, it could make its money back. That's capitalism. But that was an incredibly powerful feeling, that I could make movies just for my community, and my community would show up, and the movies would be profitable. Now, when Poison first came out, Poison is a very experimental film. I don't know how many of you have seen it. But I remember it broke records at the movie theater, at the Angelica, a fairly famous theater in New York City. But I also remember standing outside the theater and seeing a lot of people coming out going, what the fuck was... I just wanted to see some boys kissing. But they still turned up. And in some ways, that ability to use capitalism to our benefit was the most revolutionary thing we could do.
In your book, you said something really interesting about the movie A Home at the End of the World. You said that a kiss scene and a blowjob scene were cut. And you said that if those scenes were in the movie and the movie had been released in the 90s, it would have probably made the whole community come. But then in this age, it would just make the film more niche, or that's what the executive said. I was wondering how do you deal with did you agree with that? And then how do you deal with that type of, also, that seems to be like censorship?
Well, in those days, there was definitely a double standard, and anything remotely queer was immediately flagged. A good example is I made a movie called Swoon that Tom Kalin directed that came out the same year as Basic Instinct with Sharon Stone. And in Tom's movie, which was really quite chaste, the film, there is a scene where the characters are clothed, but on top of each other, and you see a suggestion through clothes of an erect penis, a suggestion. We immediately got an NC-17, which is the equivalent of an X, and Sharon Stone in Basic Instinct was, doing a lot of this. And you saw everything, and that got an R. So, it was hard not to feel that the double standard was very, very prominent. Now it's a little bit more complicated because so much goes to streaming, which is not subject to the same, ratings board. And I haven't had one of those battles in a long time. I mean, I love working with first-time directors still because they tend to be telling the story they've waited their whole lives to tell. And it's very hard to be cynical around that. And I feel like the biggest creativity killer for long-term professionals in the film industry is cynicism. It's a very hard business not to get cynical in because lots of bad people get rewarded for bad behavior. But cynicism just destroys everything. So sometimes I feel like I keep going back to first-time directors because it's a way of looking at the business again in a way that feels fresh and original. I still get excited by great stories and bringing them to an audience. Showing an audience a great movie is still one of the best things that I feel like I can ever do.
And it'll be my last question before we open it to the floor, but I was wondering, throughout your career, you've really pushed forward stories that were made by people that come from the margins or who have not always been at the center, and you bring them to the Oscars. You put them in the center of Hollywood. Is this important for you to be represented at the Oscars and to feel like we also belong there, or is it something that maybe isn't as big as we all can imagine? I don't know. What's your take on coming from the margins and being at the center?
I mean, the Oscars are one of those things that, it's very easy to say they're meaningless until you're nominated. And then suddenly they become very meaningful. And it's still, I think, a very important way for movies to find a wider audience. It does seem like this past Oscars last week was kind of a celebration of all the movies that Hollywood doesn't make anymore. And I don't know what that's going to mean in the long term. But I do feel we made a small movie called A Different Man, and that got a hair and makeup nomination. That's the only nomination it received. But even that, I believe, made people pay a little bit more attention to the film and will ultimately result in more eyes on the screen. And that's a good thing. Independent film can use anything it can get. And if the Oscars are one of the things, one of the tools in the tool bag, more power to it.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans le public?
Hi, thanks for being here, both of you. I would like to ask you if you can say to us some words about Variety. About Variety. How does it start? I mean, your first work, Variety.
Comment ça s'appelle?
Variety?
Variety?
Yeah, Variety, sorry.
The film Variety?
Yeah.
I was a production assistant on that.
You were?
Elle était assistante.
Yeah.
Donc, elle voulait savoir son premier film, en fait, son premier crédit, c'est un film qui s'appelle Variety. Mais en fait, Christine, elle a dit, j'étais juste assistante de prod.
I know. I just want to, how does it start for you? It was the first things, the first steps for you?
Yeah. Like, what was it like to, at that first step? Like, did you were like, I want this? Or? Was that an experience that helped fuel your desire to keep working in production?
Sure.
Oui.
I mean, you know, like everybody, when your first, you know, when you start your first job, I got coffee and I, you know, was the first to arrive and the last to leave. I don't remember so much about Variety. I remember a little bit more about other films that were further along, but I don't like looking back. I like looking forward.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions?
Hi. Okay. Hey, I'm here.
First row.
First row, right over here. Sorry, I get terrible stage fright when I have a mic. But I love your work so much. I often quote, I like the hat from Carol all the time. But I just wanted to briefly talk about, I'm a film and theater critic. I'm a cultural journalist. I actually started a program in the US to train critics of color that's actually hosted by the Public Theater right now. And I just wanted to briefly get your insight on, I love that your work, for instance, is something that President Trump would hate, and so is my work. And like, how do, you know, like this week, for instance, like I was named by a conservative publication in the US, and I've gotten like endless death threats and like just like harassment. And like, given how, you know, people who work for equality and to uplift everyone, how we're becoming the target of like this horrendous government in the US, how do we take care, like how do you take care of yourself? Like how do we take care of each other right now? It's becoming so scary.
I mean, you know, I guess some of the obvious answers are community, etc. But I also think a lot about the fact that, and I say this to young people, I mean, I lived through the 80s, I lived through the 90s, I lived through the AIDS crisis, I lived through the Reagan era. And those were really dark days. I'm not saying they were darker, I'm saying they were also very dark. And in the AIDS crisis, our friends were dying, and our government in the US was essentially telling us that they didn't care. And in fact, if anybody had to die from this terrible disease, it was probably better that it was queer people, because who really cared what happened to them? That's what our government was telling us. So this just seems like rinse, lather, repeat to me. And I know we'll get through it. And I know that the stories we tell are a very important coping mechanism. And I think that I can already see evidence that that queer filmmakers are rising to the occasion. I don't really know how we will get through it except with representation and community.
Je vois pas du tout la salle, donc je vous propose de prendre le micro si quelqu'un la voit un micro.
He says, pardon, la question est, avant on disait qu'on était juste gay, et maintenant c'est LGBTQI+. Before we would just say gay for everybody, and now it's LGBTQIA+. What do you think about that evolution?
I mean, I think that we should honor what people want to be called, you know? So, you know, even if it's a little bit more strenuous for those of us over 60.
N'ayez pas peur du noir, parlez.
I was wondering, at the very beginning of the masterclass, you started talking about the link between a director and a producer, and you talked about artworks, being an artist. So I would like to know, please, if there are some movies you enjoyed recently, or where do you find inspiration in link with the director?
You know, I try and watch as much as I can, and I'm lowbrow, middlebrow, and highbrow. Meaning, I watch television, and I'm not ashamed. I watch reality shows, not ashamed. I watch big movies, I watch small movies. I really just try to consume as much interesting media as I can, and I try not to be judgmental about what I will or will not see. So I get inspiration from all kinds of places. I love going to film festivals and seeing movies I wouldn't see otherwise. I went to the Rotterdam Film Festival a few years ago as a juror, and I kind of forgot how experimental that film festival is. And the first movie I saw was a 3-hour Icelandic film with no plot and no dialogue. And about 20 minutes in, I thought, uh-oh. But then I had to give in to the experience, and I had a great experience. I don't know if I would have chosen that movie myself to go see, or if I would have been able to watch it not in a cinema. But that's a good example of finding inspiration where I didn't know I'd find it.
On a le temps pour une dernière question.
C'est encore une question sur l'inspiration. Je me demandais qu'est-ce qui déclenche l'intérêt du producteur. Est-ce que c'est vous recevez le script et là ça déclenche quelque chose, ou vous entendez une histoire, où il y a un élément dans l'histoire? Est-ce qu'il y a un point commun entre tous les films que vous avez produits? Surtout, je ne savais pas que vous aviez produit Past Lives, qui était hallucinant comme film. Donc voilà.
So what sparks your interest as a producer? Is it elements from the script? Is it some elements of the story? She saw you had, what sparked your interest, for example, in Past Lives? What is it that can spark your interest in making a new project?
Yes. Oui. It's all of those things. It's a combination of the story, the script, the director. I mean, Past Lives is interesting because that's a movie, and I think I saw this at the beginning. I thought, if this movie works, it will work because everybody thinks it's about them. It's one of those films where people come up to me and they say, that's my story. And sometimes they mean, I'm an immigrant and I also have one foot in two cultures. Sometimes they mean, I made a decision at some point that changed the rest of my life. And sometimes they just mean, I've thought about the themes that are in this film. Just a quick aside, at the Academy lunch last year, I introduced Celine's song to Steven Spielberg, and he said, that movie is about me and my wife. So, but I also have to figure out, with the combination of the director, the story, the script, the elements, if I think I can get it made. And that's a whole other masterclass. That's a whole other layer of what is the path to getting this financed and made and out into the world.
Thank you so much for making all of our stories.
Thank you.